To tonight's FASD Hub Wednesday webinar, and we're delighted to have with us tonight Susie Williamson from Childline, who is going to be giving a short presentation tonight, and then we're going to have plenty of time for questions. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. There is a Q&A function you'll just see down at the bottom of your screen. And feel free to, if you get any questions at any point during the evening, just to type your question in there and we will filter those and we will ask Susie. It is a webinar, so we're not able to see you, but you are able to see us, which is a good thing. And so the Q&A function will allow you to be able to take part in tonight's event. There's also a chat function, and two of my colleagues, Lindsay and Kate, are behind the scenes this evening. And if you have any difficulties or any questions, you can also chat to them in through the chat function, or chat to other attendees through that function as well. Tonight's event is being recorded, but as I mentioned a few moments ago, we can't see you, so you won't feature in the recording, and it will be available on our YouTube channel next week. So I think that's all the housekeeping over. So I'd like to welcome Susie along to speak to us tonight. Susie's going to start by introducing herself a little bit, telling us a little bit about herself, and I will look forward to hearing what Susie has to share with us this evening. Thank you, Susie.
Thank you, Barbara. Hi, I am Susie Williamson. I am a supervisor with Childline in Glasgow, which is the Scottish National Centre. Delighted to be able to do this webinar today. FASD Hub is an organisation that means quite a lot to me personally, and I think there is quite a lot of crossover between the work that Childline does and the work of FASD Hub and Adoption UK as a whole, actually. So it's lovely to be here. Just a little bit about me. I have been with Childline since around about 2014. I started off as a role that we no longer have at Childline, but I was a switchboarder. So essentially it was my job just to take the calls coming in, say hello to the young people, and then put them through to counsellors. And I did that for probably about 8 months before I got so hooked on what I was hearing on the room that I wanted to be a counsellor as well. So went and did the training at that point and started answering chats and emails and voice calls from young people. And the rest, as they say, is history. I loved my counselling role as a volunteer so much that I decided I wanted to leave a full-time career in fundraising and come and work here as a counsellor. Childline does have paid staff. I'm going to introduce a little bit about that in a little while, about the different people who work and volunteer at Childline. I had been a counsellor with Childline for maybe 2 or 3 years when I decided I wanted to go a little bit further, became a sessional supervisor, and now I am a full-time supervisor with Childline. So it's just to warn anybody that might be thinking of volunteering with Childline, we would love to have you, but it can become a complete passion project and you may find yourself here for a very long time, which is always good. I should also say that probably my relationship with Childline goes even further back than that, because I remember it being launched in 1986 by Esther Ranson, as I'm sure a lot of people here do. I always say this in presentations. I used to make testing calls to Childline as a teenager. We call them testing calls. Other people might know them as prank calls. We call them testing because young people test out the service. But essentially, it's young people just having a bit of a laugh to see what it's like. That was me. So I am doing my penance now. I should say that on the one occasion that I have met Esther Ranson, I did confess that to her, and she very kindly gave me quite a frown and said, "I'm glad you confessed that." So we will talk a little bit about the different types of reasons that young people call Childline, but I do always feel that I should confess that. And if anyone else has done the same, as many people have since 1986, please don't feel badly about it. We encourage young people to do it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in this presentation tonight. which I will start. I'm going to share my screen. There we go. Hopefully everybody can see that.
Yes, that's great, Susie, we can see it.
Good, that's good. So what I'm going to start with here today is a little bit about who we are as an organisation. This will be familiar to many people. Childline's been around for quite a long time now, but it has evolved as a service, and this is partly why we do these presentations, is because I think there's a certain stereotype applied to Childline and what it might be for. And initially, it was maybe viewed a little bit as a place to report abuse or to talk about abuse, especially from parents. That's really not the only reason behind Childline these days. It has evolved, especially in the last few years, and the pandemic has completely changed the face of Childline. And it's become a very different sort of service, which I'll go on to talk about just now. So just looking at who Childline are, as mentioned, many people remember when Esther Ranson launched Childline. I don't know about anybody else. I was giving away my age here. I was 7 when Childline was launched. I remember very vividly the adverts with the child in the telephone box. We've never changed our name, but we have changed a little bit of the way that we work. We became part of the NSPCC in 2006. We're here for anybody under the age of their 19th birthday. Although somebody calling us after they are age 19 will not be summarily dismissed by Childline. We will always try to direct them to other services that might be helpful. Anyone under the age of 19 in the UK with any issue they're going through, big or small. And it's really as simple as that. Young people can contact us and talk about anything. Often difficult things, often challenging things, often very, very complex mental health issues, sometimes very, very serious risk. And on some occasions, just wanting to talk about what their life is like, sometimes happy things. There really isn't any defined relationship that you can have with Childline. If you are under the age of 19, you want to talk about anything, that's what we're here for. It's free, it doesn't show up on a phone bill. That's been the case since the very beginning and remains so now. We can be contacted by phone. The number is still 0800 1111. Again, some people might remember the advert. We also now have a one-to-one chat service, like a web service, where young people can come and talk. And that's much, much more popular now than it ever has been. Email is also increasing as ways to talk to Childline. And whilst there are always going to be phone calls, young people are talking to us digitally more and more. Some children and young people use all three of them, depending on their needs at the time. Others have a specific preference. We do have young people who have contacted us for years and years only by email. And sometimes they mix and match it depending on what their needs are and what they want to talk about. We are confidential. Now there is a star there, and I'm going to go on to explain confidentiality at Childline in a little while. We're not absolutely confidential, and there are reasons for that I'm going to go into in a little while, but we're available anytime, every single day, every night of the year, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Who are our counsellors? We are supported predominantly by volunteer counsellors. So that's people who just want to give us their time, essentially. We also have some paid staff. It's worth saying it is one of the most intense volunteer roles you can take on, also one of the most rewarding. But it's not small in its expectations. We ask people to come in for 4 hours at least every week, including briefs and debriefs after shifts. And that's quite a long time to give up your time every week. So it does become something that, you know, people love. We have people who've been here for 20 years plus. We have people here who, you know, come and they stay for 6 months. Both are very welcome, but the longer the better, as with any organisation. They're a mix of different ages and come from many walks of life. You can become a volunteer as young as the age of 16. And a lot of people are surprised by that, but actually there's no better person to talk to a young person than another young person. And we find that our very young counsellors are actually extremely successful in their conversations with other young people. Sometimes young people want to not have to talk to another adult about what's going on in their lives. And it's very welcome that we do have people as young as age 16 because they bring a perspective that those of us who are older might not have. We have counsellors in Scotland, England, Northern Ireland and Wales. Counsellors travel into bases for set shifts because we are a confidential service. So if counsellors are talking on the telephone or by one-to-one chat, it's done on a base with input at all points from supervisors like myself on shift. Over the pandemic, we developed a service where, because people weren't able to come in for shifts in the same way that they were, you can sign up to answer emails, and there's very specific training for that, and you can do it from home. It's a slightly different service in that it's not live. It's still monitored by supervisors and it's all done online. Volunteers receive training over a 12-week period, and that is intense, and especially again over the pandemic, it's now all online. It's done nationally. And it's a combination of live online modules and observations, including role play, which, yeah, I make myself the most unpopular person in any situation because I actually really like role play. I don't know if that's a frustrated actress in me or not. Other people find it really intimidating for obvious reasons, but that's the best way to learn as a childline counsellor, is to test it out and to actually talk as if you were talking to a young person. It's the only way to do it. But it can take a lot getting used to, and it is a big ask of people signing up to volunteer here. We've very recently been recognised by the Scottish Qualifications Authority, so if you do join Childline as a volunteer, you will actually be gaining a qualification, which is testament to the intensity and the comprehension of that training. This is always a popular question that we are asked. If you tell anybody that you work for or volunteer with Childline, people will ask, what do young people talk to you about? This has changed massively, which is why I'm showing you what it looks like for 2020 to 2021, and just in the past year or two. Over the pandemic, it has changed a lot. When I first started as a volunteer, I remember really high risk contacts by call or by web chat as being fairly infrequent. If you got one on a shift, it was relatively unusual. Most of our calls were about people talking about everyday young people things: school, bullying, friendships, sex, relationships, and occasionally risk, but nothing like it looks like now. So these are the top 5 recorded reasons for contact in the last few years. Mental and emotional health. We're getting more and more contacts, young people struggling with mental health issues, which is partly down to the impact of the pandemic, partly down to the pressures on other services like the NHS or like CAMHS. But more and more we're getting young people coming through talking about mental health. And that's a trend that's likely to continue, unfortunately. Suicidal thoughts and feelings, similar. That's coming up more and more in shifts. Sometimes it is thoughts and feelings, sometimes it's actually active suicide attempts. And again, that's a lot to ask a volunteer to come in and handle, but it is something that is coming up more and more for Childline. Family relationships, again, that's an impact of the pandemic. More young people at home, isolated, unable to go out the same way that they used to across the pandemic. They weren't in schools. So, you know, the impact of being with a family that you might not be entirely happy with, you can imagine that is something that they would want to talk to Childline about. Self-harm, as with suicidal thoughts and feelings, that's increasing. We're hearing about that a lot more. Doesn't necessarily indicate that there is more of it. It might just be a case of that more young people feel able to talk about it. But certainly it is something that we're hearing a lot about on the phones. And sex relationships in puberty. And it always heartens me to have at least one of these 5 as being something you would expect to hear from children and young people. There are many, many other reasons that we record on our systems for young people contacting us. As you can imagine, all forms of abuse, physical, emotional, neglect, and sexual always come up. There's exam stress, there is school issues, there are any number of things that come up, but these are the main ones. Again, over the last few years, this is the number of calls and emails and online chats, and it's just increasing all the time. And it's relative to the number of people that we can possibly have in the room answering calls and chats at any given time. I dare say that if we had hundreds of more counsellors, we would get hundreds and thousands of more calls and emails and chats. The demand is there and will always be there. Over the pandemic, we saw a huge increase in online channels, especially on the Childline website, message boards. This is where young people can leave messages for each other, public messages which are checked by a moderator, I should say, but there was a massive increase in that. They were talking to each other about the impact of the pandemic, how they were feeling about it, what it was like not to be able to go into school, having, you know, their worries and concerns about actually catching COVID, all of those things. Young people were supporting each other with, as well as talking to Childline. We saw an increased engagement through Childline's social media as well. For obvious reasons, the online world just took off in a way that it couldn't possibly have before. 74% of all counselling sessions take place online, which I mentioned earlier. As you can imagine, if you're talking to somebody on the phone, it's much easier to get to an understanding of what that person wants to talk about. You can hear tone, you can convey empathy, you can start building a rapport and a relationship in a call in a way that you just can't in text. It takes a long time to build trust. Some young people really like it because it's anonymous. They feel that they're not having to share too much of themselves. Nobody can see them, nobody can hear them. They can sit in a room with people around them and use their phones to talk to us backwards and forwards in a way that might not be safe if they were on the phone. So online chats are our most popular way of young people getting in touch, but they do take longer, which then impacts resource. If we assume that suicidal thoughts and self-harm are also mental health concerns, that means that 50% of all our contacts are to do with mental and emotional health. We had 16,000 counselling sessions across that year about abuse and neglect. Again, doesn't necessarily mean it was happening more frequently, but the impact of young people being at home more often, for longer, and sometimes not able to be in touch with safeguarding places like schools meant that there were many, many more contacts about abuse and neglect in a lot of different forms. I mentioned earlier on about confidentiality at Childline. This is our confidentiality promise. We don't hold absolute confidentiality because young people, by law, need to be safeguarded in some situations. We do it as much as possible. We try to involve the young person or the child as much as possible and try to be honest and open about them, about whether or not we can hold confidentiality. Sometimes it's just not possible. And that's usually because we think that they're in danger, or that they're being hurt by somebody who might hurt other children or young people. Those reasons are there. And that this is actually taken from Childline's website. This is what young people can see. What I'm going to show you now is a little bit, and I mean a little bit, of the training that we give to our Childline counsellors. Some of this is going to seem really obvious. It goes a lot more in depth than this. What I'm going to touch on here is a tiny bit of what we ask people to do here at Childline when they volunteer or work here. We have a dedicated counselling model. This is relatively new in its form and has come up over the last few years. I'm very proud actually to have been part of the pilot project for this counselling model, which is designed to address more than the surface level of the reasons for young people contacting us. It's an enormous privilege to actually take a contact from a young person where they share really personal stuff on the phone or in a chat. And in order to sort of meet the needs that were coming out from young people and to try and address a journey with Childline rather than the same conversation with counsellors over and over again, we had to develop a counselling model that met some of those needs. So this is how it looks in its form at the moment. This is what volunteer counsellors are trained in. The skills and the things that I'm going to introduce to you today completely form this part of our counselling model, building the relationship. And as you can see, it doesn't even touch all of these other things that we train our counsellors in. In order to do that, it would be a training course across 12 weeks. It goes much, much deeper than that. As you can see, we have specific sort of models around non-immediate concerns and also immediate concerns involving high risk, such as suicide ideation, suicide attempts, fairly serious and high risk abuse and self-harm. What we're always hoping, as you can probably see from the model here, is that an immediate concern, which might present as emotional crisis or immediate high risk, where we can apply parts of the model to that, we can bring it back to a non-immediate concern where we actually get the chance to talk to a young person about what's going on for them. This part of the model where we talk about where the young person wants change or appears stuck is to try and help them actually develop ways of finding their ways out of the situation that they're in, rather than just holding them in that situation and talking to them about the same thing over and over again. Because every time you contact Childline, you will likely be talking to a completely different counsellor. It's a stranger on the end of the phone. Potentially, you could just be in a situation where you just have the same conversation about the same issue over and over and over again, which will result in you feeling more stuck than you were in before. So that's why we have this model. There are different ways of talking to young people about different things. Oh, wrong way. So these are our very initial skills. This is a very, very rudimentary introduction to what it's like to support young people to talk. Again, anyone who has a young person or a child in their lives will think, I've done this. And yes, absolutely, it's based around just communication. But actually, this is the fastest way we can get into the lives and the understanding of what a young person wants to talk about. Simply being present, focused and engaged. It's a stranger on the end of the phone. For some young people, that can be really intimidating, especially if it's something that you are worried about sharing, if it's about something that's happening in your life that you're worried about people finding out about. It's a lot to pick up the phone and talk to a stranger. So wherever we can, we're fully present, we're focused and we're engaged. We use a lot of reflection at Childline. We're not there to tell them what to do, unless, of course, they absolutely need that help. Reflecting expressed feelings. It's a little bit like when you're sat in a car next to somebody, it's much easier to have a to and fro conversation, especially if it's about something that's quite difficult. The same happens on the phone or through a computer at Childline. We're doing a lot of reflection and a lot of allowing the young person just to talk about whatever they want to talk about, but all with feelings. Listening for emotions behind the words. I can't tell you how often we hear at Childline, I don't really care, it doesn't really matter. Would you pick up the phone and talk to a stranger about it if it didn't? So we're always listening for more than what's actually expressed. Helping them to identify and name emotions, that can be really difficult, especially if you've not been introduced to that in your life before. If you have been in a situation where you're encouraged not to express emotions, it's never really been discussed with you. People that brought you up or that you've lived with never talked about that. It can be really hard to start to talk about something that's really affecting you. This is massive at Childline, empathizing, not sympathizing. We won't ever say, you know, that's terrible, that's awful, oh, that's horrible to hear that. That's about the person that's hearing it rather than the person that's saying it. So we empathize. I can hear that's difficult. That sounds like it would be really tough to deal with. And empathy is massive at Childline, as you can imagine. Listen without interruption. Again, it sounds really basic, but sometimes, especially with children and young people, as adults, what we want to do is tell them what to do. Oh, don't do that, that's dangerous. Yeah, so talking to Childline has to be different if we want them to trust us. We'll just let them talk. Open questions. So that's anything around who, what, why, where, something that encourages a continued conversation, not just, you know, as you can imagine, especially with teenagers, you're liable just to get back yes or no, or I don't know quite often. The open questions are what we use in order to try and encourage children and young people to talk to us. We use silence and we give space, especially on the phone. And I think sometimes, you know, it's easy to imagine a service like Childline might be about, and young people expect this from us. What should I do? Tell me what to do. And sometimes we have to say, I can't. We don't know. We don't know you, don't know your circumstances. We don't know what it looks like for you. I can't tell you what to do, but I can help you work out what you think is best to do next. Sometimes people are really surprised about that. We are adults on phones talking to young people. We don't tell them what to do unless it's absolutely essential for us to do it. In order to help them to understand their problem or situation, we try to break down overwhelming issues. Sometimes it is just a case of they come on and they share huge amounts of information. Sometimes it just takes a little while. We don't generally talk for much longer than an hour because any more than that can be absolutely exhausting. But we try to break down overwhelming issues into manageable parts and separate things out. We ask some direct closed questions with caution. Closed questions will always bring out, I don't know, no, yes. The times when we might use closed questions is when we need immediate information. Are you safe? Are you in a place that's safe? Do you need our help? Do you need us to call somebody for you? That's the times that we would use closed questions, but we do it with caution. We explore context alongside identity. Identity is massive for young people at the moment. So it's important that we acknowledge that, we allow them, sometimes they don't know themselves. So trying to apply an identity to young people is always a really bad thing to do. It's better to let them explore it and to explain it, because, and I'll hold my hands up now and say, I can't imagine what it's like for young people now to have so much understanding about identity, but so little understanding of how it applies to themselves. It's still a really difficult world to be able to express yourself in as a young person. So we always focus on identity. Explore how events and situations impact on them. We gently challenge where appropriate. It's never going to get better. It's always going to be like this. My life is ruined. We do gently challenge it. Yes, it feels like it right now. It doesn't mean it can't ever be different, and maybe talking about it will help. We have to gently challenge sometimes. We help them to view things from a different perspective. Again, if you can imagine, if it feels like you are always going to feel like this, it feels like I am always going to need to self-harm to cope. Actually, it might not be like that. but there is a time and a place to be able to look at things differently. And that's, as I say, a very rudimentary introduction to what we do at Childline. It goes much, much deeper, but I would need maybe 3 or 4 hours to go through our whole counselling model, which is probably not what anyone is here for. We are always going to need volunteers, as with any organisation that is voluntary, especially right now. We need more people. If you have ever thought about volunteering at Childline and what it might be like, if it feels like it might be something for you, please get in touch. We're desperate for volunteers at the moment. We just can't get enough people in to answer contacts. And again, if anybody wants to ask me about that later on, then please do. And I think we've got space for some questions.
Lovely, thank you very much, Susie. That was really interesting. I learned a lot there, and I've certainly got a list of questions here for you. You were making me think back to the launch of Childline as well, when my sister used to be one that did testing calls. I didn't know it had a name, but my sneak into the phone box and dial the number. It was always engaged. And then she would hang up, and then she got the fright of her life one day when somebody actually answered. Yeah, it's interesting to know that it wasn't just us that did that. So a few questions. You're mentioning there about volunteers and people who support your service. What do you think makes a good volunteer, a good counsellor working with children and young people?
Oh, yeah. I would say open-mindedness, if that's the best way to put it. Being a young person is hard at any time. Being a child is hard at any time, actually. That transition into starting to find out who you are and to think about what your life's going to look like later on, that's always been difficult. In the context of what's going on recently, and also in the context of the fact that young people now have access to the entire world's information in the palm of their hands, it is increasingly complex. They have access to more knowledge and information than they ever have. But with that comes increased worry, confusion, mental health issues, uncertainty, which has always been there for young people, but it's there on a massive global scale now. And then throw in a pandemic, and then throw in a really serious world situation, and then throw in lack of access to services, and it's really complex. So we're looking for people who can open-mindedly take that journey with young people. It can be really hard to break out of a feeling of, I'm an adult, you're a child, you need my help, I'm going to tell you what to do. Don't be doing that thing, that's really dangerous. Yeah, that's really difficult as an adult. And as a parent, actually, your instinct is to want to prevent bad things happening to children and young people. Unfortunately, we can't. All we can do is support them and try to help them find their way forward. Childline's all about empowerment. We want to build young adults who are able to cope with their own lives, and for them to know that they can come to us and talk about anything and not be judged. So that's the sort of person it takes to volunteer at Childline, is somebody who is able to be open-minded enough to hear young people rather than want to tell them what to do. And
can I ask you just to turn your screen share off, and then we can see a bigger
Sure.
picture of you?
Oh, excellent.
That's better. We can see it now. So we've had a question, and just thinking about supporting and sort of being a volunteer. Do you volunteers suffer from like compassion fatigue, sort of burnout? And do you have any experience around that? What kind of support can you give volunteers?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that has become more apparent than ever before. We're asking people to sign up, not knowing what's coming in the next contact. Whereas, it used to be, and we're only talking about 5 years ago even, it used to be that you had a rough idea of what young people would be wanting to talk about, and it would always be eye-opening, educational, as young people always are. It didn't involve the levels of risk that it does now. So, you know, it can be really difficult. We're asking people to voluntarily come in and listen to the absolute worst possible scenarios that they could imagine a young person being in, and a little bit more. And that's tough. So we have 15 minutes brief before every shift. We have up to half an hour afterwards, and sometimes a bit more, just depending on what people have heard on the phone. There is always space to talk at Childline. You will not be able to set foot in the door without somebody at some point saying to you, "How are you?" And it's a standing joke. You will hear it over and over again, but it's genuinely meant, especially for people who are here every single week. There will be periods of time where volunteers need to take a step back and say, "I can't do this just now. I've heard it too much. That call was too difficult." It's quite often the unexpected calls that really trigger off a response in people. It might relate to something that's going on in your own life. It might relate to the wider situation in the world. But it's usually things that you didn't expect were really, really going to hit home. And we always have to be aware of that, because we don't want people coming in here traumatized by a volunteering role. And we can't guarantee you. That's the difficult part about volunteering at Childline. You don't know what's coming in next. So we have to really take care of our volunteers and our staff. And it's a cliche in some ways. It's bandied about all the time. Self-care is always talked about here because it's so needed. It's so needed.
And we've got a comment in the chat here. Somebody's saying that this is something they'd be interested in doing, but they fear it might be triggering for them. My daughter suffers from mental health issues and used Childline last year. I cannot thank you guys enough. You saved her life. They had to break confidentiality to speak with me. So I just wanted to share that with you.
That's lovely.
There's obviously there's a lot of appreciation there for the work that you do.
And it's, you know, we so rarely hear the outcomes for young people. I mean, that's another difficult part for everybody involved, is that the points where we have to break confidentiality, that's a really tough call. I have found myself on shift contacting police and ambulances more this past year than I ever have in my time at Childline. And it's always a bit of a heart wrencher for the counsellor and for the supervisor, because you know that it's an impact on that young person, but it can be positive. Sometimes it is that changes direction of things, and they get the help that they needed, and the people in their lives become aware of how difficult it's become. We hear all the time, "I could tell my mum, I could tell my dad, but I don't want to worry them." And we are then in a position where we're trying to explain to them, "Do you not think they would worry more thinking that you couldn't go and tell them this?" But we only have them for an hour on the phone or in a chat, and we can't be certain what their perspective's like or what their home life's like. So it's always difficult. And, you know, it's lovely to hear, especially from an adult in that young person's life, that it was appreciated, and we're glad.
We've got a few questions around FESD and neurodiversity as well. Could you maybe tell us a wee bit about what the counsellors at Childline, what understanding they have about neurodiversity? I know we're going to be doing some work together very soon, and supporting people to learn about neurodiversity, and likewise Childline are going to help us with helpline skills. Is FESD becoming something that's recognised by young people when they phone, or by volunteers and counsellors working in your organisation?
So interestingly, I listened in to my first call mentioning FESD just in the past month or so. And the young person that made that call was actually, what I'm going to say is, they were educating the counsellor and telling them, because they hadn't heard of it, and they hadn't heard, you know, and because of the spectrum disorder that it is, We hear from a lot of young people, I think and believe, impacted by FASD, but they don't know that's necessarily what it is. The more that it's understood and heard, the more that we can talk to young people about what sort of support they might be able to seek to direct them towards services that specialize, like yourself. And as I say, it's only something that's come across my radar because I have a personal understanding of it and a personal connection to it. And I'm quite passionate about introducing more of it because we're hearing more and more, especially from young people who are impacted by care experience, by adoption, by neurodiversity in a lot of different forms, and especially autism. Autism comes up a lot. And sometimes they have a really good understanding of what that means in their life. They have good support around them. They might have access to services that are really doing a great job of explaining how they can help and helping them. But the impact of a pandemic is that they haven't always been able to access those services. So our counsellors, we do run trainings and we connect with organisations like yourself, which is exactly what we're doing here, is to try and develop counsellor awareness and invite them into sort of webinars and workshops. We do have some mandatory trainings, especially about the developing brain in children and young people, so that there's an understanding of the different things that can impact them. And it's massive. You know, how long is a piece of string? It is absolutely massive. We're never going to have an understanding or knowledge of everything. But the more that we can open up the conversations with young people, the better. And the more that our counsellors are aware of the different things that can impact young people, the better.
Do you think that young people who call generally have a better understanding of maybe mental health than those did a number of years ago? Because it wasn't talked about at all, certainly when I was that kind of age.
Yeah.
But at school, it's something that they learn about a lot more now.
Yes. And I think, again, that thing that I talked about earlier on, probably in a slightly more negative way, of all that information that you can access, anybody can access. It tends to, I mean, the internet is a very strange thing, and it's had such a massive impact, especially during pandemic, when that was how everybody talked to each other and, was used as a positive tool and sometimes as a negative one. If you are looking for specific helpful information, sometimes that can be really challenging, because generally, if you are looking for support, what you're going to be facing is, here is what you're going to have to do. So you will also hear from young people who are actually looking for other young people actively seeking not to go and get that help and not engaging with the services, because that's less confronting, it's less scary. So even though they've got all that information and they can go and find out absolutely anything in the world, they tend to keep it very small and to their own community and to the young people that will understand. And sometimes coming to Childline is the first step out of that. I recognize that, I'm almost in an echo chamber where everyone I know feels suicidal. And we talk to each other about feeling suicidal and what happened last week when that person in our group actually attempted suicide. You can hear how young people bounce off each other and they wonder where they're going next with it. So, I think there's scope for helping young people to understand how to use the resources, social media and the internet in a much more focused and helpful way, because sometimes actually it just becomes an echo chamber, and they're sort of stuck. I know what it is, I can see what it is, I've got a name for it. The number of young people we hear talking about wanting a diagnosis of something. I think I've got bipolar, I want it diagnosed. And we have to have the conversation where we unravel it a bit. Yeah, a diagnosis might really help, but actually it's also difficult to have a label that you then don't know what to do with. Sometimes having the label doesn't help. So it's about, sort of being able to connect the dots between, okay, I know what it is, what do I do about it? And Childline has a big part to play in that, but it's massive. It's massive now, because there's so many different mental health conditions we can talk about, and young people can openly talk about feeling suicidal and self-harming in a way that they never have before. Self-harm was something you would never have spoken about but now it's there, we still don't know what to do about it.
I can hear there's a real sense of trying to empower young people through the work that you do, which is great. But it's also hearing that a lot of your volunteers are hearing a lot of difficult and really challenging situations as well. Do you find that volunteers get too involved, or is that something you encourage because that's what they need to be able to do to support the child or young person? Or
yeah, it's a really fine line. I mean, we ask it's such a strange thing to ask somebody to do as a volunteer or as a member of staff, actually. It's the most challenging, complex thing you could actually sign up to do. We want you to come and be compassionate and empathetic, and we want you to listen and to absorb those feelings and to help the young person, but don't get too involved. You're going to be listening to them on the end of the phone or talking to them through a computer, hearing them express the most difficult things in their lives, but don't get too involved. And that's a big ask, because as human beings, it is completely natural to feel impacted by what other human beings are going through, especially young people, especially children. That's what we're designed to do, is to protect children. And especially at Childline, this can be surprising to people, but it's something that we have to talk about. When we hear from young people who are potentially being abused at home or anywhere, we don't always necessarily step in to take them out of that situation. Young people are surprised by that. Adults are surprised by that. Services are surprised by that. Schools, social services, police. Sometimes, why are Childline not tackling that? And the reason for that is because actually it could make the situation more dangerous. We could make it worse. So that young person has managed to contact an adult on the end of the phone or by chat and to say, this is happening to me at home. If we then immediately call the police, potentially the perpetrator knows that they've informed somebody and can then manipulate the situation to make sure that they don't ever get help again. So that's a very difficult fine line to ask anybody to. You're going to be hearing a young person who's potentially being abused on the phone, and your instinct is going to want to be to go and rescue them from that situation, but we can't, because actually it might make it worse. And if we were to attempt to go and rescue every young person in danger that we hear on the end of the phone or through a computer, we would never be done doing the rescuing. We have to help young people to, for want of a better way to put it, rescue themselves, to empower them, because in the long term, that's going to be so much better for them if they can find a way to ask for help themselves, get themselves safely out of a situation with Childline support, rather than us doing it for them. But it's a big ask.
I know that we've got quite a few members of staff here tonight who answer helpline calls and who support families on a one-to-one basis. And I think that's something that all of us working directly with families are constantly negotiating that line, and trying to find the best path to take. And sometimes you take the right one, sometimes you don't, and that can be difficult to deal with as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've got a few minutes left. I've got a few more questions just about, I guess, about the kind of mechanics about how Childline works. So do you get a lot of repeat callers, I guess is one question. Or do you not know, do you keep any kind of records of the calls?
More so now than ever before. So yes, we do keep confidential records after every single contact. That is what we would call substantive, where we've had a conversation that has been about something. We take notes. We take very brief notes about what the young person said. We take notes about what we did and said. We take notes about, to some extent, their identity, their age, their gender, if they're willing to share it. They always have the choice not to share it, by the way. But we do, so that if they come back again and they call from the same number or use the same account that they log into the Childline website with, then they have a relationship with Childline. And the next counsellor, because it will always be a different counsellor that you talk to every time generally, the next counsellor can see what the young person's talked about before, and it's not like starting a conversation from the very beginning, because especially in really difficult situations, especially things like, for example, sexual abuse, you don't want to have to be explaining that over and over and over again. So it's building a relationship with Childline. In the past couple of years, we have developed a team at Childline who we know as the contact management team. And this is for young people who are coming through prolifically, sometimes 5, 10, 15 times in a day. And partly that's because they have very complex needs. Sometimes it's because they're in very serious situations. Sometimes it's because it's the only organisation that they have in their lives that they rely on and feel safe with. And that's a double-edged sword, because they can become so reliant on Childline that when they get to their 19th birthday and they can't contact us anymore, they don't know where to go and what to do. So if they're contact managed, as we call it here, it helps to build a relationship, but also to prepare them for the end of that relationship in a similar way. For example, if they were accessing counselling in a therapeutic sense, we're not those counsellors, but if you were in that sort of therapeutic situation, it wouldn't go on forever. It has to come to an end at some point, and we're looking to try and help them develop the skills and abilities to access the help that they need beyond us, or actually to be able to cope on their own. So it's always about, you know, sort of looking to the future for young people. Some young people call us once and that's all they ever need. Some young people call us once an hour, and that continues. So it has to be looked at, and that's become something that's become really prevalent, especially over the last few years.
And is it more boys than girls that phone, or the other way around?
This is an interesting one, actually. We've recently run a campaign called We All Feel It, which was specifically designed to encourage young people who identify as male, because the proportion that we see recorded predominantly, you know, females come and talk to us a lot more, and it's quite hard to encourage males to open up. And that's, or as archaic as it is, that still exists. Girls are encouraged to, you know, voice their emotions and to show emotions. It's okay for girls to cry and be open about it. You'll find that, you know, that they'll talk with their friends, and, you know, whereas boys are still encouraged to not show emotion. Boys don't cry. So that campaign specifically was to encourage young men to come and talk to us. And it, you know, we saw a big increase in contacts, but we still have to encourage it. Societally, we're still struggling with that stereotype of boys are tough and girls cry. And nothing could be further from the truth.
Another couple of questions coming to the end. This is a bit of a curveball one, but what would you do if a young person phoned up and they were intoxicated? What kind of skills could you use to support that young person?
That's such a good question, because again, there is a very, very fine line to walk here. It depends on the immediate situation. If they are in danger, then we will work around that danger specifically. If they come and they just want to talk, but they tell us, actually, I've taken this substance, I have had a lot to drink tonight, we will always encourage them to go and wait till they're sober and then call us back, because in some ways they don't have capacity and they may share something that they're not necessarily willing to share or fully in control of. And given that our confidentiality promise is not absolute, that then completely strips them of their ability to control that situation, if you see what I mean, and to work out what they want to share. So if they are very heavily intoxicated and in danger, We will then be working with them to get them to a place of safety or to get services to come out to them. If they are not in danger, but are very obviously under the influence of something, we will bring the contact to an end sensitively, but relatively quickly, because they may share something they're not fully in control of.
Okay. That's really interesting. I wouldn't have thought of it that way before. Yeah. So obviously we work with parents a lot in the hub, and I know it's something we've spoken a wee bit about before, the two of us, just about the role of the parent in helping a young person access support. What if somebody has a young person and they're at in crisis point, what would you recommend a parent could do to support that young person?
Let me tell you, nothing gladdens the heart of a Childline supervisor than a young person supported by an adult on the phone. It's not infrequent. It does happen, but it's amazing when it does happen. Sometimes it will be an adult on the phone saying, like, I have my 15-year-old with me just now. She feels suicidal. I don't know what to do about this. So I'm coming to you because you guys will be able to help. Can I let you talk to her? And they'll hand the phone over and say, I'm just in the next room. I'm going to leave you with this person to talk privately, because you know, that's amazing. And at the end of the day, as I've recently found out myself, being a parent doesn't automatically give you all the answers. In fact, anything but. My husband and I quite often joke about, you know, when ours is a teenager, will he be phoning Childline? Absolutely, yes. Because the way that you interact with your own child and the way that you interact with other people's children on the phone at Childline, completely different. But if you don't know the answers, you might find actually it will really help your young person to say, do you know what? I don't know the answers, and I'm not going to tell you what to do, because I don't know what's going to take it away or to make it better, or if it can be made better. I don't know what we do next. So why don't we find out together? That's empathy. That's being with your young person, because sometimes what we hear on the phone is that if I tell my mum and dad, they're going to lose it, and they're going to get really angry, and then they're going to restrict my world. They'll take away my phone, they'll take away my computer, they'll unscrew the door off its hinges, and I will never get privacy again. So I am not telling my parents. So, you know, there's a very fine line between being able to be a parent who does the thing that parent does, which is, you are not doing that anymore. I am going to take away every sharp thing that you own in order to prevent you from hurting yourself again. That's your instinct as a parent. But actually, that might not be the right course of action. And if you can somehow manage to find, and as I say, I'm saying this, I'm not sure if I would be able to do it as a parent. Go into some place like Childline, where somebody is caring but at a distance and can see it out with the immediate situation, because you love your child and you don't want them to be in that situation and you just want to stop it. Whereas somewhere like Childline or any other service, talking service that supports young people, can take a step back and say, okay, well, let's look at this, and what do you actually want to do, and what would help you right now?
I guess it's parents modelling that it's okay to ask for help, which is something that a lot of adults struggle with, and it's something that young people come up and they, as adults, they struggle with as well. So no, that's great. Thank you very much, Susie. You've answered a lot of questions there. Really appreciate it. It's been absolutely fascinating. I have learned a lot, and definitely I would be saying to my daughter, who's in my mind, about phoning Childline around any issues that she has. It's also dispelled some of the myths. It's not the organisation that started way back in 1986 when Wet 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 released their single, which I may or may not still have. They released it, I get by with a little help from my friends. So the organisation's moved with the times and technology, and just the way it's come through the pandemic and lockdown, and we very much appreciate all you do to support children and young people. And we're delighted that you're embracing FESD. And we're going to be involved in training some of the Childline counsellors next week and just getting the word out there. So it's another resource that our children and young people and their families can access as well. So thank you very much again for coming along, Susie, and thank you everybody for joining us this evening. The session has been recorded, so it will be on our YouTube channel next week. If you would like to learn more about Childline, then they've got a website that you can go along and have a look at. And if there's any questions around FESD, then feel free to get in touch with our helpline and we can offer you support around that. So thank you very much for attending, everybody, and we hope to see you at our next webinar, which will be after the summer holidays, and more details to follow.